Hello. So today we'll be solving a paper that was requested by one of my viewers in the comments section. Janedazir, I believe. My apologies if I've pronounced it incorrectly. But it's May, June 2018, paper 1, variant 3. So it's AS MCQs. And let's jump straight in. So question 1 of this paper was actually interesting because the marking scheme, rather sorry, not the marking scheme, but the examiner report indicates that this was the question which had the most people getting it wrong in terms of percentage, which is quite odd because you don't expect that to happen with question 1. And it largely occurred because they phrased the question in such a weird way. So if you were solving this paper and you got this question wrong, I wouldn't be particularly hard on yourself because the phrasing is a little odd. But let's go through it anyways. So you have a PPC, and you have desks on the x-axis and chairs on the y-axis. And they've asked the opportunity costs of the fourth and the fifth desks produced by the firm. Now, the incorrect way of doing this is to just look at, oh, what's the opportunity cost of producing 4 desks? And that would be the 2 chairs you have to give up, which would then give you B, because there's only one option of 2 chairs. But B is the wrong answer. And the reason for that, and the somewhat technical phrasing, is that they aren't asking the opportunity cost of producing 4 or 5 chairs. They're asking the opportunity cost of the fourth and the fifth desk. So what happens when you go towards the fourth desk and then when you then produce the fifth desk? So four desks implies that there are 4 desks you're producing. Fourth desk is just one additional desk. It's the fourth desk that you're producing. So that was a slight issue with the phrasing that most people attempting this paper did not catch, and unfortunately picked B, which was the wrong answer. So if you look at the fourth desk, that is just the cost, the opportunity cost of going from 3 to 4, so producing the fourth desk. So what would that be? So at 3 desks, you were producing 4 chairs. And when you increase the desk and you go to the fourth desk, you are now producing 3 chairs. So the opportunity cost is simply 1 chair because increasing output of that desk decreased output by 1 chair. So that automatically gives you A anyways, but let's look at the fifth desk. The fifth desk then is just going from 4 to 5. And at this point, you have 0 chairs. So it's going from 3 to 0. So the opportunity cost is 3 chairs. And that's why you have A. So a simple question, but just because people didn't focus on the phrasing a bit, most people got it wrong. So do pay attention to phrasing whenever solving such papers. A government proposes to introduce a road congestion charge, which would require private motorists to pay a toll for road use. So they would have to pay for using the road. Which statement related to the proposal is normative? Now, the worst way to look at or to think about positive and normative statements is to think about them as facts and opinions. That is just not correct. They aren't just facts and opinions, and they aren't facts and opinions straight up. Positive statements are descriptive statements. They describe a situation, they make a prediction about a situation. They can be correct, they can be wrong, but because they are just descriptive, that is what makes a statement positive. Normative statements, however, are statements which require some amount of value judgment. So some amount of what is right, what is bad, what is fair, what is just, what ought to be, what shouldn't be. So some moral like justification you're looking at, some value judgment you're looking at. So as opposed to the true positive statements. So we're looking for a normative statement. Now, bus drivers will benefit at the expense of motorists is probably true, but even if it wasn't true, it's a positive statement because it's just saying that, oh, this will happen. It's not evaluating a situation. Motorists with higher incomes will be prepared to pay the charge in return for reduced journey times. They might be prepared to, they might not be prepared to. This is just a statement which is making a prediction. It's just describing a situation or a future prediction. Thus, it's positive. And motorists with lower incomes would not be afford to use the roads. This is still positive because it's simply saying lower incomes motorists would not be able to afford to use the roads, which is probably true. But even if it wasn't true, the point is it's just making a statement about it. If it said they won't be able to use the roads and that's unfair, or that's unjust, or that's bad, that would be a normative statement. But it doesn't say that. So given as it is, it's simply a positive statement. which gives us option D. The proposal will be unfair. Again, what is unfair? This is a value judgment. Like, this is just not fair. That's what the value judgment, the morality you're including to motorists which have no alternative means of transport. So the fact that you're saying this is unfair rather than simply making a descriptive or a predictive statement, that is what makes it stand out as a normative statement. A firm changes the type of product it produces. What might limit the firm's ability to use division of labor? And as you all should know, division of labor is where the production process is split into and divided between your laborers, and they're all working on specific parts of the production process. So one laborer is making one laborer or a team of laborers are just focusing on one aspect of the product, as opposed to a team of laborers making the entire product from start to finish. The new production method, and we have to look at what limits this. So now, what doesn't do away with division of labor, but what makes it a little harder for the firm to employ division of labor. The new production method is more capital intensive. That's not relevant. It could be capital intensive. It could use machines, but you can still divide the production process and still have division of labor. The new production method is very expensive. If it's very expensive, you should probably have division of labor. It doesn't limit it in any way. It's probably more useful then. The new product is made specific to customer requirements. Now, you can still have some degree of division of labor here for sure, but to a large extent, it will still limit the ability because it'll make it more difficult, because then every product is going to be a little different. So it doesn't make sense for one person to just be focusing on one aspect of the production process. So it's easier to have division of labor when products are just standardized, so that everyone's just putting together their individual pieces. Every piece is the same, so you just can break it up into laborers. But if it's customized, then division of labor can exist and does exist. But in the final finishing touches of the product, it's very difficult. So you don't really have division of labor as easily there. And the product requires specialized labor. So you require maybe specialized, high-skilled labor, but that makes it difficult to produce in general. That doesn't in any way talk about division of labor in specific. A group of tourists become stranded on a desert island. They decide to use their own system of money. Which statement about their choice of money is correct? So hopefully you recall the characteristics of money and the functions it has to fulfill. Coins in their possession would be suitable if there are enough of them. And that's true. Like, coins are used otherwise. They're durable. They can help dividing money. There are limited amounts, so if there are enough of them, it's fine, because you just don't want a couple of coins. Otherwise, there's not enough to even make regular exchanges. But if there are enough of them, coins should work. They work in the real world as well, so there's no reason why they shouldn't work in the deserted island or the desert island, whatever. Fruit fallen from trees would be suitable because it has intrinsic value as food. Now, coins and money, and generally what we look at in our theory of money, we don't need it to have intrinsic value. Intrinsic value is inherent value. That is, that it has some value in itself. So fruit does have some value in itself because it can be eaten. But coins and like paper money doesn't have intrinsic value in itself. But and the point there is that you don't need intrinsic value. You don't need money to have a value in itself. All you need is for people to accept it. So as long as it has general acceptability, it doesn't need intrinsic value. If anything, fruits are perishable, and perishability is not a good quality in money. So this would be incorrect, because kharab ho jayenge, so like they just go bad, so it won't really help since they're perishable. Pebbles from the seashore would be suitable because they are both durable and plentiful. The problem is durability is a good thing, but if they are plentiful, that contradicts one of the theories. One of the characteristics of money is that should be in limited supply. There should be scarcity, because if it's plentiful, then that's a lot of money. And then if everyone has money and if everyone can just go and pick up pebbles from the seashore and new pebbles, then what's the value of a pebble? Like, why would people accept it? And that becomes a problem. And seaweed has a similar problem, because if it's in unlimited supply and it keeps washing up on the beach, then it's not limited in supply, and then there's no value. Why would anyone accept seaweed as a form of money when anyone can just go and grab some more seaweed from the beach and use that and spend that? What is likely to affect the position of the demand curve? So the position of it, so not like your equilibrium point, the position of the demand curve itself. So we're talking about shifts here. Movements would be affecting the position of the supply curve and thus leading to a movement in the demand curve. For tickets to pop concerts, but not the position of the supply curve. So the supply curve should not shift. A change in incomes of potential customers. So what we do know is income does change demand, and if income increases, demand will increase, and that your curve will shift. So this should be the right answer. A change in the price of tickets to the concerts. This will lead to a movement, but it won't shift the position of the demand curve. Change in rents charged with the venue owners would add to costs, and this would shift your supply curve. It would decrease supply, shift it to the left, and we're not looking at that. We don't want supply curve to change. A change in the seating capacity of the concert venues, again, um, both of these, depending on what the change is, whether it's positive or negative, they will either increase or decrease the supply curve, so which is not what we're looking at either. Since the supply curve was supposed to be the same, the demand curve was supposed to change. Okay, so there are passenger journeys on a train, and this is the demand curve. The initial fare is OP. So this was what was happening before, this price and this number of journeys. But then it's reduced to uh, reduced by PW. So it's OW. So this is what's happening now. Which area measures the amount spent on the extra journeys resulting from the lower fare? So not just the number of extra journeys, but the amount spent on it. So these are the extra journeys, but initially you were at R, now you're having S amount of journeys. And for the amount spent, just multiply it by the price. And the price right now is W. So you get this box. This area is the extra amount spent due to the lower fare. So if you look at it, this is UT. Okay, so URST. Oh, that's T. So that's always a little odd because you're trying to figure out the order of which they've written the answer, but you figure it out eventually. All right, the demand curve for a product. If the rectangle OLMN is equal to the area of the rectangle OPQR, which statement is correct? But first, let's figure out what this equality in area means. So OLMN, so this particular area, this is, you should know the total revenue. Total revenue when the price is at this particular point, the quantity as this point, at this point, because the area measures the total revenue since it's price multiplied by quantity. And we're saying this is equals to this particular area. What is this particular area? This particular area is when the price is at R and the quantity is thus at P. So we're saying both of these rectangles are the same, which means both of the total revenues at different price points is the same. The sameness, the equality of the areas is given in the question. A rise in price from OR to ON results in the same proportionate fall in quantity demanded. Now this is true, and let's think about this for a bit. Recall the concept of unit or unitary price elasticity of demand. What we know about unit or unitary price elasticity of demand is that if price increases, let's say by 10%, quantity demanded falls with the same amount of percentage. So the same amount, so 10%, for example. And the reverse is also true. And the implication of this is total revenue never changes. Total revenue is always the same. Here, the reason why we can say that this is a case of unitary PED is because we know the total revenue is the same due to this price change. So this price change should lead to the same proportionate fall in demand because it is unitary PED. And we know it's unitary PED because the total revenue is the same. So yes, option A would be correct because the changes in price and quantity demand in terms of proportion or percentage would be the same. Let's look at the other options as well. Let's clean up a bit here. Maybe we can use a different color. Consumer surplus falls by RSMN if the prices rise from OR to ON. So the initial consumer surplus at OR was this triangle, below the demand curve, above the price. Now the consumer surplus is this triangle. So it hasn't just fallen by RSMN, it's also fallen by this particular area as well, which they haven't included. So you can cross this out. The PED is unitary for all changes in price. This is also wrong. We know that for this particular change in price, the price elasticity is unitary because in this particular case, the total revenue does not change. We don't know that throughout the demand curve, and if you do recall some theory, the price elasticity of demand does change throughout the demand curve. So you can't go with D. And if you look at the last one, which says that total revenue falls by MSQ if price rises from OR to ON. So if you look at total revenue, uh, in fact, we've already talked about this. We've already shown how both the triangles represent total revenues at different prices, and the total revenues are the same. So clearly, the total revenue should not fall, and thus you can cross this out as well. When the supply of a good decreases, equilibrium price stays the same. What is the PED of a good? So you can draw the diagrams with all the options. I'll just go ahead with recalling the concept and drawing the diagram accordingly. If you look at this particular demand curve, here the supply won't affect price, because if this is supply one, and supply falls by shifting to the left, clearly the price is still the same. The flatter a demand curve, the more elastic it is, and if it's completely flat, that's the case of perfectly elastic PED, it yields a very, very high value, which you call an infinitely high value. So the lower a value, the less the PED, the more inelastic it is. The higher the value, the more elastic it is. It's more elastic, so it has a higher reaction. Right. So the curve in the diagram shows a relationship between price and quantity of a product. It has not been given a label. And we have to describe the curve. So this could be where PD is equal to 0, because this is vertical. The more vertical a curve it indicates that it's more inelastic, and this is a case of perfectly inelastic demand. It could also be a case of perfectly inelastic supply, because we don't really know whether this is a demand curve or whether this is a supply curve. So let's just look at whichever option we find in the options given. Perfectly elastic demand curve would be horizontal, so no. It is a perfectly inelastic supply curve, which is vertical, as just discussed. A relatively elastic supply curve would be slightly more, would be flat, not horizontal, but like more flat, so that's not it. And a unit elastic demand curve is something like this, usually. And thus it won't be that either. The diagrams show some information about oil, and we have to look at it. So we have to look at the demand and supply changes here. And what we can induce from the first diagram is that the supply of oil is increasing. You can see by the fact the bars are going higher. These are millions of barrels per day produced. However, the price of oil is decreasing. You can see that by the fact it's going down. So that's what we have to look at. Supply increases to the right. So this is a decrease. You can cross that out. This is an increase. That's good. In this supply is not even changing, so you can cross that out. In this supply is decreasing, so you can cross that out as well. And clearly you can also see from option B, which is a correct option, not only is supply increasing towards the right, prices are also falling, which is also what we needed. So it's 10B. In which set of circumstances will prices play no part in determining how resources are allocated between alternative uses? So how you decide which resources will go towards producing which type of goods. So whether you produce footballs or whether you produce, I don't know, chicken kathais or whatever. Point being, which type of goods are you producing? But may still have a role as a rationing mechanism. A rationing mechanism is essentially how price can act as a mechanism to ensure who can get the product and who cannot. And the answer is the person who can pay the price can get the product, and the person who can't does not. That's used when you don't have enough products for everyone. So government sets maximum prices for all goods above the market clearing price. Let me just also draw this and show that how this would have no impact. So it's if you have demand and you have supply, this is the market clearing price, the equilibrium price. Now, if you set maximum price here, this is ineffective, because maximum price says the price, it's a price floor. It says, sorry, it's a price ceiling. So it says that the price can't go higher than this, but the price is already lower than it. So this will literally have no impact. It's what we call as an ineffective maximum price. The same logic applies here. Minimum wages for all workers below market rates of pay would just, if you draw a similar supply of labor, demand of labor, wage rate diagram, if you're just setting minimum wage here because you're setting it below market rates of pay. So that has no point because it says the wage rate should be above this. It can't be below this, but the wage rate is already above this. So this will literally have no impact either. The quantities of consumer goods produced are determined by the government. This is true. In this case, prices won't have any role to play because the which consumer good to produce and the how much of that to produce is determined by the government. However, since the option does not elaborate, we can assume that who gets the consumer goods could be decided by the price mechanism, i.e., the rationing mechanism in this case, whoever can pay the price. And the total income consumers have to spend is fixed by the government. I mean, that fixes the income, but that does not necessarily fix or decide which goods would be produced, how resources will be allocated. So you can cross that out as well. What is necessary for consumer surplus to be zero? What you should know is if you make a normal demand diagram, demand supply, consumer surplus is this area. So below the demand curve and above the price level. So let's just look at these diagrams. If demand is perfectly elastic, it's horizontal. Let's make a supply curve randomly here. So clearly, consumer surplus is below the demand curve but above the price level. In this case, the demand curve and the price level are the same thing. So there is no region below the demand curve and above the price level. So in this case, consumer surplus would be zero. And you can pick that. In a perfectly inelastic case, demand is like this. This is supply. And in this case, it's again below the demand curve but above the price level. So this would be an infinite amount of consumer surplus. It just keeps going on and on. So you can cross this. Supply is perfectly elastic. Let's just draw this here because I'm running out of space. Supply is perfectly elastic, but you have a normal demand curve. You would have some amount of consumer surplus denoted here. So you can cross that out. And if supply is perfectly, sorry, this was where supply was perfectly elastic. That's why it was horizontal. When supply is perfectly inelastic, let's say something like this, you can still have an amount of consumer surplus. So it won't be zero. So you can cross that out. So option A is being proven both directly and by elimination. Let me just rub this before we go on. But anyhow, let us proceed. So the local government decides to issue a card for residents that gives a 50% reduction on entry prices for visits to local museums. The diagram shows the demand curve for a resident, so it's a demand curve for that specific individual who currently makes 3 museum visits. So currently they're making 3 museum visits. So this is what the original equilibrium so-called was. But now you have a 50% discount, and the demand curve shows that they'll make 5 visits. So what is the change in the consumer surplus? So if we in red, if we denote the initial consumer surplus was this below the demand curve above the price. Now the consumer surplus is all of this below the demand curve and above the price. They've asked for change in consumer surplus, so you won't take into account W because that was there from before. The change is just addition of X and Y, which I've slightly covered with my ramble scribbling, but hopefully you can still see it, or if not, you can remember it. So I will go with B. The demand and supply functions for a product are quantity demanded is equals to 1500 plus 50 price, 50p is price, and quantity supplied is 300p minus 2000, where p is equals to price. No shit. With government regulation, the current price in the market is $15. And now we have to see what's the regulation. Is it effective maximum price, effective minimum price, and then make an assessment on demand supply? So to figure out whether it's effective maximum or minimum price, we would have to first see whether it's above or below the equilibrium price. So let's firstly calculate the equilibrium price. And the equilibrium price is obviously the price at equilibrium. At equilibrium, quantity demanded is the same as quantity supplied. It is the place where demand and supply intersect. What do we know about quantity demanded? Refer to this. It is 1500 plus 50p, and quantity supplied is 300p minus 2000, right? So we can do a couple of things. This is what's going to be. Oh, so we can take the price value on the right hand side. So that would be 300p minus 50p. That's 250p. We can take the other non-price variables, like the constants on the left hand side. So that would be 1500 plus 2000. So that would be 3500. And that gives you that price is going to be equal to 3500 divided by 250. And if I just use my calculator, because I don't know what this is, yeah, that gives us 14. So the equilibrium price is $14, and the regulation price is $15, which is greater than $14. And the options we've only been given as of effective price controls. So when do you place, let's just draw the diagram as well. When do you place the price above the market price if you're putting an effective price control? So a price control that actually does something. And you do that, if you look at it, uh, right, you do that when you have a minimum price. Because if this was a maximum price which said it has to be below this, well, the market price is already below this. So for it to be effective and actually have an impact on the market, it has to be a minimum price which says it can't be below this, which is why the price that's being used is not 14, is actually 15. So we can select C and D. And if you look at it, this minimum price intersects the demand curve, giving us quantities demanded here, intersects the supply curve, giving us quantities supplied here. There's more quantity supplied than quantity demanded, so that is surplus. So you have more, and that is essentially excess supply, not excess demand. That would be a shortage. So 14D is your right answer, and you can pick that. Which element of a tax and benefits system is regressive? Regressive essentially means that the percentage impact on income for the poor is more than people who have a relatively higher income. So it hits the poor harder. Stuff like sales tax and all are usually regressive. Income taxes are usually proportional or progressive. Rent subsidies to tenants of publicly owned housing would probably help the poor in those publicly owned housing and would help save their income. So that's not regressive. Specific taxes on beer and tobacco is regressive because specific taxes in general are regressive. The logic here is if you have a tax on, let's say, $1 on every, I don't know, box of tobacco, or bottle of tobacco, then if a rich person is buying that, $1 to a rich person is nothing. So the percentage impact on their income is very, 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 very low. But $1 to a poor person buying that is a lot. So the percentage impact on their income would be much higher. And thus it hits the poor harder than the rich. And thus it is regressive. I mean, sure, probably beer and tobacco aren't the most important things and are demerit goods. And the question isn't asking whether the specific tax is good or bad. It's just asking whether it's regressive. And the truth is, it is regressive for people who aren't as well off, who do purchase these goods. The payment of child benefits to families will just help these families. It can help poorer families as well, especially because they are the ones that usually get child benefits. So that's not regressive. And the taxation of capital gains, so the gains made by your capital goods or the gains made either by hot money or other sorts of investments, all of that is usually conducted by people who have a certain level of income, not people who are poorer. So if anything, this would hit higher income families who actually engage in such investments more rather than poorer income families. So thus, this is actually progressive in a way. It's not regressive. Right, so the first 15 questions done, and let's move on in just a bit. All right, so let's continue. Question 16, let's choose a different color for no good reason. A government decides to encourage apple consumption. As a report states that eating apples is good for health. Well, you didn't really need the report, honestly, like every child's book would tell you that. So it subsidizes apple growers. It's doing that because if apple consumption is good for health, that is in a way a merit good. It is a private benefit to yourself. But if your health improves, it is a general societal benefit as well. And it subsidizes apple growers. So What subsidies do is they reduce cost of production, allowing supply to increase, which moves supply right. Supply and demand both increase right and both decrease left. So what would the subsidy be needed to change the market equilibrium from Q1 to Q2? This is the original market equilibrium. You want market equilibrium to be here. So you want your new supply curve, so your S1 plus subsidy to be this. Now, to measure a subsidy and also to measure a tax, what you should know as you go to the new equilibrium, you simply vertically see upwards. So the vertical distance between the two supply curves gives you the per unit subsidy that is required. And the amount of subsidy that's required would be from P1 to P3, that is C. So that would be the per unit subsidy that is would be required. They haven't given any other option for us to calculate the total subsidy, so clearly they're not looking for that either. What is not a transfer payment? Transfer payments are those payments that you make to people for which you don't expect or you don't receive any good or service in return. So any economic value in return. So if you pay a carpenter to come build a chair for you, that's not a transfer payment because they've provided you a good. If you're, I don't know, if you just give someone ED, that's a transfer payment because you've just given them money for which nothing is meaningfully expected back in terms of a good or a service. So what's not this? Benefit payments by government to families who have children is not a is a transfer payment, so we can cross it out because it's just being paid based on social or humanitarian grounds. Uh, you don't get any economic good or service directly in return. Like there's a benefit, the children could grow up and then become productive members, but the point being you don't get anything part of a contract of giving the payment, so give me something in return. Disability benefits paid to soldiers who were injured while on military service. So that's again, you're not getting anything directly back in return. It's just something you're doing out of social reasons or whatever. Loans made by a government to students who are studying at university. Again, the the contract of a loan doesn't get you a good or a service in return. It simply gets you your money back. Yes, so it's a transfer payment, which they then will return. But it's not like you're giving them a loan and then they're giving you, I don't know, some sort of chocolates or some sort of good or a service. They are studying in university, but studying is not a good or a service. You're receiving a service. Teachers are providing the service. You're not producing service. Yes, in the future, these students might go out and start producing goods or services. But the point being, in this specific case of giving a loan, you're not directly receiving back any good or a service. So it's still a transfer payment, and you can cross that out. Payments made by a firm to compensate employees for undertaking dangerous work. This is a transfer payment. Why? What are you getting by these payments? You're getting employees who are working on dangerous things, but they wouldn't work on dangerous things if you wouldn't pay them that higher amount, right? So this is essentially just wage. It's just a higher wage because the work is more dangerous. So what you're getting in return are people who are producing a service, i.e., working in a dangerous environment. That's what you're getting in return. That's why this is not a transfer payment. A government allows one firm to go out of business. All right, quite weird of them. Takes over another firm and encourages a foreign government to invest heavily in a third firm. This government's really, really wild. Something we can all relate to, unfortunately. Anyhow, what government action has occurred? So you can select nationalization for sure because the government is taking over a second firm, so it's taking over a private firm by itself. So that's nationalization. Now, you shouldn't pick privatization because one firm's gone out of business. So that has nothing to do with privatization. It is encouraging a foreign government to invest in a third firm, which is again more in the line of nationalization. Nationalization, well, not really nationalization, but more of private sector ownership going to government or state ownership, but just another state in this case. But for privatization, you need something more related to a firm or an industry that's owned by the state, which is then becoming owned by the private sector. That's not happening here, and thus there's no privatization in these three examples. So you can pick 18B. what is both a valid statement, so it has to be correct, and consistent with the features of the diagram. AS cannot be increased beyond some level of real output. Now, that is a true statement. That does happen. Beyond the level of your potential output, you can't increase supply from there because you've achieved the level of full employment. You're employing all of your resources. Uh, and this is that level, which the diagram also shows. Because at this point, the curve is going to go up and up and up and up. So no matter how much you keep increasing aggregate demand, the output would just be capped or maxed out at this point. And thus, it is in line with the diagram. The diagram does show that. Consumption is a component of AD. Now this is 2. AD is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So it is a component of AD and is lower when general prices, level of prices is lower. This is wrong. When prices are lower, consumption is actually higher. So logically speaking, it's also shown by the diagram that when prices are lower, the aggregate demand, as you see, is greater. The output is greater. So if consumption is a component of AD, if anything, even the diagram shows that AD is higher when prices are lower. Investment is a component of AS. It's a component of AD as well, and mainly. So I'm not too sure if this is true. It can affect AS as well. So this is a little more ambiguous and is independent of the general price level of prices. This is clearly wrong because if it is a component of AS, clearly AS is varying with the level of prices. And it also logically doesn't make sense as well. Obviously, it varies the level of prices. You'll have to look at the situation and how much an investment will cost you, which is dependent on the level of prices before you invest. And it's not just not in line with the diagram. So if it is indeed true that investment is a component of AS, it's usually we look at it as a component of AD, but it can affect AS. So if it is a component of AS, then AS is varying with the level of prices. So it's not independent. The greater the demand for a country's exports, the lower will be AD. This is just not true. As you can see here, if there's higher demand for your exports and there's more export revenue, there's a direct relationship. So AD will also be higher. It won't be lower. So you can just cross that out because that's not a valid statement to begin with. The average consumer divides his expenditure between food, clothing, accommodation, and transport in this particular ratio. So a ratio of 2 for food, 1 for clothing, blah, blah, blah. During the course of a year, the price of food falls by 2%. The price of clothing increases by 4%. The price of accommodation increases by 10%. And the price of transport remains constant. Assuming that the weights of a price index, these are the weights, because these are the weights because they reflect the expenditure of the average consumer. These are the weights because this is essentially the ratio of expenditure. And what they're saying is that the weights that are used in inflation calculation are actually representing or reflecting the ratio of expenditure. What is the increase in the index over the year? All right, so let's try to calculate this. So the increase in the index over a year, essentially how much does the general level of prices rise when you account for weights as well. Please don't forget to account for weights. So let's use a different color for no good reason. So the first thing you have is food. So the price of food falls by 2%. So I'm going to put a minus sign and 2%. I don't have to convert it or anything because the final answers are also in percentage. So I can just keep it in percentage. So the minus sign is because the price of food falls, multiplied by the weight, which is 2, plus the price of clothing increases by 4%, so it's plus 4. The weight is 1, plus the price of accommodation increases by 10%, and the weight is 4, plus the price of transport increases or decreases by 0%, so it remains constant, and the weight is 3. And you divide all of this by the sum of the weights, which is 3 plus 4, 7, plus 1, 8, plus 2, 10. So this will give you, so this is going to be 0. This is going to be minus 4 plus 4 cancels out. This is going to be 40. upon 10, 4. Positive 4%. We kept it in percentages throughout. And that you'll get 4%. Some people do this like minus 2 into 2 upon 10 plus 4, 1 upon 10 plus 10, 4 upon 10, blah, blah, blah. It's literally the same thing. If you want to do it like this, that's the same thing. You can go ahead and do it. Point being, it's just mathematically, it's literally the same thing. So you shouldn't be too concerned about that. All right. So the table shows an extract from a country's current account of its balance of payments account. So the current account is what we're looking at from its BOP. I'm not going to read this because I'm lazy, so let's read the question first before just mindly, like just like literally without introduction, just going through the information and wasting time. Let's look at the question first. What is the value of exports of export of goods, G, and what is the value of the balance of trade in services, X? Which is H. So they've drawn a distinction between the balance of trade in goods and the balance of trade in services, because obviously you have that distinction in the current account. So let's see. The balance of trade, I'm going to say subscript of G, so it's balance of trade in goods, is obviously the export revenue of goods minus the import expenditure of goods. I'm just writing G's here just to ensure that we don't get it mixed up with services. So do we have the balance of trade in goods? We do. So this is minus 110,196. Too many numbers, but okay. The export of goods is G, so that's the unknown, minus the import of goods is this, 417006. Then you're simply solving it. This goes there and changes sign, so it becomes 417006 minus 110196. If I pop that into my calculator, they really could have used some easier numbers so that people can just calculate mentally. But anyhow, you get 306810. So that narrows it down to between A and B. Let's use green now. So again, balance of trade, let's say services, is just the export revenue from exporting services and the import expenditure from importing services. So we do not know the trade in services. That is H. That is what we have to calculate. So we'll just keep the unknown here. We know the export of services is 204,465 minus import of services is 126369, and you just pop that into your calculator, and you get a value of 78096, which gives you A. So question 22. In June 2016, the UK voted to leave the European Union. Let's highlight this. UK voted to leave the European Union. God knows why they did that, but anyways, the table shows what happened to the value of the pound sterling before and after the vote. So initially it could buy $1.48. Now it can simply buy $1.32. So because it can just buy fewer amount of dollars now, the value of the pound has gone down. It has depreciated. Something which clearly the voters had not thought through, but anyhow, the UK is a major trading nation, so it does export, it does import. Now, an interesting about imports, especially when your currency depreciates, is it does lead to inflation, in particular cost push inflation, which can also more specifically be called imported inflation. And why is that? So your price of your imports are going to increase because you're importing in the other currency. You're importing in USD, for example, but it's more expensive to buy USD because your own pound value is less. Your own pound is weaker. So when you have to buy something, you have to import something in dollars, for example, it just costs you more now because it costs more to buy a dollar in the first place. So the import price rises. Now, I'm not going to make a comment on the impact of on the quantity of imports, and then the overall expenditure bill of imports, because that does depend on elasticity of demand of the imports and also then applies to exports. But that's not something we know for sure. In this question they haven't mentioned elasticity, so we don't know whether it's elastic or inelastic. But irrespective of whether it's elastic or inelastic, we do know that the price of imports rises. And if you are a major trading nation, you are going to be importing a reasonable amount of stuff. That does mean lots of your production would also probably consist of imports as raw materials or as some sort of addition in the production process. So generally, higher imports for a major trading nation do increase costs. They increase costs in the production process, or they increase costs generally of finished goods. But point being, it's just higher prices. So there's either the price increases or the cost increases. And because of cost of production rises, your aggregate supply decreases, which increases prices. That's what's called as cost push inflation. So an increase in cost push inflation would be your answer. Disinflation is where inflation still exists, so prices are still increasing, but the rate of increase of prices falls. So the rate of inflation falls. So instead of 10% inflation, you now have 5% inflation. It's still inflation, but it's not. It's at a lower percentage. But this is contradictory to what we're saying, because increased disinflation implies that there's more disinflation. So like from 10% you're going to 5%, maybe you're going to 3%. So this is actually a reduction in inflation, and that's not at all that what we're saying will happen. You won't have more purchasing power of money, you'll actually have less, because again, your own currency has depreciated. It can buy less dollars, it can buy less stuff, so there's less purchasing power of money, if anything. Reduced demand pull inflation. This could be true, but it also could not be true. It depends on what happens to your exports. So a depreciation will reduce the price of your exports, but the impact on quantity demanded for your exports will depend on the elasticity and whether it's elastic or inelastic. We don't know about that, so we can't make this comment. We have to cross this out. Just to add the purchasing power of money, I think a better way to explain it, because it's not the purchasing power of your currency in the foreign exchange market, it's the purchasing power of money. So that's more domestic, and that's more linked to inflation. So I think that's a better way to explain it. So just to correct myself in a way, the purchasing power of money will fall, but that is more so due to the fact that we've already shown why inflation would occur. So if higher inflation occurs, that's why the purchasing power of money would fall, because you can buy less stuff for the same amount of money. Right. So to what does the J curve effect directly relate? So hopefully people remember the J curve effect. The J curve is something like this. That's where the J comes. Right. And the idea here essentially is that the exchange rate can impact your balance of payments or your balance of trade. So these are things you can write here. And this is your time period. So let's say you're at a situation where you have negative balance of trade payments or balance of trade, or you have just negative exchange rates in that sense. So, and what happens is you incur depreciation, so the value of your exchange rate falls. What the J curve effect essentially says is that because in the short run, this is the short run, this is the short run because the time period is not as much, you're earlier on the time period axis. Since you have inelastic exports and imports, I'm not going to draw out the entire thing, but because you have inelastic exports and imports, the balance of trade just gets deteriorates even further, so it gets worse. But after a certain point in time, as you go towards the long run, elasticity changes. As we should know, elasticity, things get more elastic in the longer runs. So after that particular point, since you have elastic exports and imports, your balance of payment or balance of trade would improve if you have depreciation occurring. This is a theory. Again, I didn't use this theory while solving the question above, because in this, we're not sure. It is a short-term impact, but we're still not sure whether it's inelastic or elastic in the short run. So we don't use it unless it's specifically mentioned. And this theory is just a theory. But yeah, so What does the J curve effect directly relate? Balance of payments and time period, yes, but balance of payments effects caused by exchange rate changes. Why exchange rate changes even though we have time period on the x-axis? Because exchange rates is what is causing this. So this the J curve is showing what happens when something depreciates. How does it impact your balance of payment? So depreciation is the change in exchange rates. Exchange rate effects caused by balance of payment changes, not really. It's not showing balance of payment changing causing exchange rates. It's showing how a change in exchange rate, how a depreciation can impact your balance of payments when you look at it at different time periods. Import expenditure effects caused by tariffs. Where on earth did tariffs come from? There's no mention of trade comparative advantage and trade creation from that, so you can cross those out as well. The terms of trade. So your terms of trade are the prices of your exports upon prices of your imports. For a major oil exporting country of Saudi Arabia fell from 223 to 205. So this fraction fell. And it can either be because the price of exports decreased or the price of imports, because if that's in the denominator, increased. It can also be for a variety of other combinations where both are changing at the same time. But let's see if we need to look at those complexities. Uh, yeah, option C just directly corresponds with this. A fall in the price of Saudi Arabian oil exports. That's exactly what we're talking about. A fall in the price would simply decrease the overall ratio and thus would decrease your terms of trade. A fall in the amount of oil can be linked, but it's not as direct. It's not as true as part C. Follow the amount of oil produced or exported. Again, that's talking about volume or quantity, and we're looking at prices. And appreciation of the Saudi Arabian currency, if it appreciates, price of exports will actually increase and price of imports would decrease. So this would just increase the terms of trade, not decrease your terms of trade. The price of exports would increase because if a currency is more valuable, then other people, other countries buying your goods would have to pay for that more valuable currency that you're selling it at. And if your currency is more valuable, you can easily buy imports at the international currency or at the dollar value much more easily because your currency is more valuable. So it's easier to buy the foreign currency than required to import. So that's why the last part won't be it. Oh God, this is a lot of information. Anyhow, so a particular good in the Barbados market could be supplied by domestic producers or producers in Trinidad and Tobago or producers in the United States. So these show the respective prices of production. Originally, Barbados had 20% ad valorem duty. So it's an ad valorem tax essentially. And it's ad valorem because it's a percentage, it's not just a specific tax, which is just an amount. So on imports from both of these places. So originally, you would have plus 20% on both of these, not obviously on your local production. So that has to be factored into the cost. That's going to be on top of price. Barbados then formed a customs union. So let's try to segment this. So Barbados then formed a customs union with Trinidad and Tobago. So clearly now it's plus 0% tariff or quota because once you are in a customs union, these two buddies are in a customs union, they're not going to charge each other taxes on imports, and they're not going to charge each other such duties or tariffs. But they have a common external tariff of some against all other people. So like the United States. So the United States will still be paying a 20% tariff. No, well, the United States wouldn't be paying a 20% tariff, but its products would have a 20% tariff. So if you would import from there, your consumers would pay for it, which is why you probably wouldn't import from there. So who would you import from before the formation of a customs union and after the formation of a customs union? So for before, you know the price, it's at $1 locally. These seem cheaper, but you have to factor in the plus 20%. So you could either calculate plus 20% and you could just add that, or you can just multiply it by 1.2 and it's the same thing. So 1.2 into 0.85, that is the Trinidad and Tobago price. That is 10, wait, yeah. So 1.2 into 0.85. Yeah, that is 1.02. I think I got a zero wrong. So initially it was coming 10 and I'm just like, what? So 1.02. So you definitely would not import from here originally because your local price is cheaper. It's cheaper by 2 cents. This is a TNT, Trinidad and Tobago. For the US, that's 1.2. It's 1.2 because it's 20%. So the 1 stands for the original 100%, and it's 0.2 for the 20% in addition to that. 1.2 into 0.75. This is 0.9. So you would import from the US originally because your local price is $1. So it's just cheaper to import after the tariff as well. So you would import from the US initially. What happens after? After, you're still going to have to pay 0.9 from the US because the tariff is the same, it's still 20%. But from Trinidad and Tobago, you don't have to pay any tariff because you're in a customs union with them. So that's 0.85. And clearly 0.85 is cheaper than your local price, is also cheaper than the after tariff price of 0.9 from the United States. So now you'd import from Trinidad and Tobago because if you don't impose a tariff on them and you're still imposing a common external tariff on the United States, Trinidad and Tobago would be cheaper. What would reduce an economy's protection against the import of cars? So now you have less protection against imports, so less protectionism. A higher quota of imported cars. So it's very easy to cross this out and be like, oh no, that's worse because you're just having more quotas. You have a higher quota. Oh, that's what's going to have more protection, not less. But this is actually the right answer because quota is an amount of units that you can import. So like 100 units, 1,000 units, million units, whatever. If you have a higher quota, this means a larger amount of units that you can import. So you can import maybe instead of 100 units, you can now import 200 units. So that's a higher quota. So here it's easier to import cars because there is more space. There's like more units of imported cars you can import. And thus the protection that you have, that is less because it's easier to import cars if you have a higher quota. I'm not saying it's completely easy, it's just relatively easier. A higher subsidy for domestic car producers would protect against imported cars because then domestic cars are more competitive, they're cheaper, so they can fight back against imported cars. A higher tariff on imported cars would have the same effect. They would just make imported cars more expensive. So then people would, the domestic industry would be protected since people would also buy from the local car manufacturers since they would be cheaper. A lower exchange rate does very similar things. So a lower exchange rate essentially means if your exchange rate is lower, then the prices of imports is higher because it costs more to buy the international currency and import. And if the prices of imports are higher, that also acts as protection for your local industry. A country takes no part in international trade and its domestic market price is PT. So this is what the country was doing before, no trade. The country then decides to engage in free trade and the market price also rises. So it rises all the way to the world price actually. So now the market price, the domestic price and the world price are the same thing now after this change. And that's this. So how much would you want? Uh, so while suppliers would want to sell you this much, the amount you're going to consume is this much because that's where the price intersects the demand curve. So you're just going to buy this much now that you have started engaging in free trade, but also now that your market price has also increased. The market price has also increased. If the market price had not increased, then you would not be bothered. Then the world price would just be above your domestic price. So you wouldn't have engaged in free trade anyways, even though it was illegally allowed. So what happens to consumer and producer surplus when the economy engages in free trade? So let's look at some stuff. Let's make this a little less cluttered. So your consumer surplus initially was this, below the demand curve, above the price level, the original price level. Now what your consumer surplus is, now this is the price level. So below the demand curve, below the demand curve and above the price level is this. So your consumer surplus decreased by X and Y. So domestic consumers lose X and Y. Domestic consumers gain Z only. Well, for the same reason, it's not Z. Domestic producers gain Z only. I don't think domestic producers gain anything because the world price is the same as the domestic price, so you just import everything. So domestic producers lose X plus Y plus Z. They didn't have X plus Y plus Z to begin with, by the way. So if you look at everything like this was your original domestic equilibrium. This was your consumer surplus there, and below the market price and above the supply curve was your producer surplus. So note, the producer surplus never included X and Y and Z. So you can't lose something you never had. So you can also cross T out. Uh, Oops. A government increases the basic rate of income tax to finance additional spending on apprenticeships and training. What types of macroeconomic policies are being used? So fiscal policy is definitely being used. Fiscal policy involves tax rates and government spending. Monetary policy involves exchange rates, interest rates, money supply. None of that's being used, so you already have C. But it's also supply side, just to explain this, because apprenticeships and training will help your labor become more productive, help them produce more in the long run, and it does help improve aggregate supply. So it is a supply side policy as well. But anyways, just by looking at the second option, you could automatically just isolate to begin with. If an economy experiences a persistent balance of trade deficit, the balance of trade is export revenue minus import expenditure. And if it's a deficit, export revenue should be less than import expenditure, so that since import expenditure is a negative one, overall balance of trade is negative then, because it's in a trade deficit. It may choose to place tariffs on imports of manufactured goods. When might the use of tariffs solve a balance of trade deficit in the long run? What you want to do, you want to reduce the, not the number, but the expenditure on imports. So you want to reduce your import expenditure. So that's what you want to do by imposing tariffs. So that this becomes less negative, and then hopefully balance of trade can become less negative, or maybe even go towards the positive side. If an economy imports a sustainable amount of raw materials, I mean, it's still going to keep importing those raw materials. So that won't solve it. They'll be more pricey, but they won't necessarily reduce the expenditure on raw materials. It might, in fact, just increase them. So when an economy is experiencing a high rate of inflation, how does that work? So if you have a higher rate of inflation and then you impose a tariff, that won't necessarily solve the problem, because then imports are also more expensive, but your local goods are also expensive anyways because of high rate of inflation, and your exports won't work in the first place because they're too overpriced because of your high rate of inflation. So the tariffs won't really solve the problem properly in this case either. When the demand for imports is inelastic, that's terrible, because then the price of imports is going to go up. Why? Because of the tariff. So the imports are going to become more expensive, and because it's inelastic, the quantity demanded for the imports will just decrease by a slight amount, which means total revenue for the people who are exporting, but like total expenditure for us who are importing, will just increase. So your import bill is still increasing. That's doing the opposite of what you want. So by elimination, you have D, but also when the supply of domestically produced goods is elastic makes sense, because what you do want is if you've imposed a tax on, rather a tariff on imports, you've made them pretty expensive. You would want your domestic supply to quickly be able to expand and be elastic and respond to that, and thus fulfill the market demand instead of the imports very easily. Also, if this particular supply is elastic, then if you make your imports like more pricey, they can also afford to increase prices by a little bit. And since it's more elastic, the quantity supply would increase by much more. So they can very easily satisfy the local demand instead of your imports. Bulgaria's consumer price index changed at an annual rate of minus 2.2% from in 2016. In May, the annual rate of change was 1.4%. So you constantly have some deflation here where prices are falling. which fiscal and monetary policy would be most appropriate in the short run to restore price stability. So both of these are demand side policies, and you want to be increasing aggregate demand so that prices in a way rise, and then you have some price stability to counteract the effects of this deflationary pressure. Fiscal policy, decreased government spending. Let's write the AD formula. It's C plus I plus G plus X minus M. If you reduce government spending, AD will just reduce, and we wanted to increase AD. So you can just cross A out. Decrease taxes. If taxes decrease, disposable income increases, so you have more to spend. So thus you will consume more, and thus, since consumption is a function, is a factor affecting AD, aggregate demand will also increase. So yeah, decreased taxes is good. Increased government spending is good. We just discussed government spending. Increasing taxes is bad because that reduces your disposable income. So the reverse explanation applies here. So we can just cross these two things out. We don't have to discuss them since we are only interested in option B and option C. So should you increase or decrease the rate of interest? So what happens if you increase the rate of interest? If you increase the rate of interest, there's a higher incentive to save because you get more money in the form of interest if you save in the bank where there's a higher interest rate. And if you're saving more, you just have a limited amount of income, right? So if you save more of the income, you're going to spend less of the income. So you have less consumption. And we've already explained why less consumption means less aggregate demand. So this is not what you want. Remember, we wanted higher aggregate demand. So instead, what you want to do is decrease interest rates, because if you decrease interest rates, the incentive to save is less. Instead, you'd rather consume. And if you'd rather consume, that will increase aggregate demand. So that does the trick. So that will be 30 part C. Right, so that was an entire paper. If anything was unclear, and it is still unclear, feel free to ask in the comments. If you want to suggest another paper that you think I should do, let me know in the comments as well. And if you like the content I produce, do like, subscribe, share the word, all of that type of stuff. All right, thanks for watching. That'll be it for today.